Hello and welcome to the Underhive. We are back with some more How to Command the Death Guard. In this series, we're going to take a look at every aspect of the Death Guard. So whether you're looking to get more out of your army, or you're thinking of dipping a toe into Nurgle's crusty cauldron, then there's something here for you. Now, in this episode, we're going to take a look at the Contagion Discipline Spells, and nothing's really changed about this since Warzone Nephilim, besides the fact that the Malignant Plaguecaster has dropped by 5 points, so you might find it a bit easier to squeeze in an additional cheap Psyker, and may end up taking more of the spells than you would otherwise have previously. But there are, of course, a lot of other ways you could spend those additional points you have now, so you may not intend on taking an additional cheap Psyker. But either way around, in case you're new to the game, the Psychic phase is the third phase of any given turn, so you'll use your command phase abilities, you'll then be able to move, and then you will use your Psychic abilities. So you will be able to reposition, to an extent at least. Granted, Death Guard are pretty slow, but you will be able to reposition to an extent to be able to reach specific targets with specific spells in most cases. There will be certain scenarios where you simply cannot arrange for that to happen because Death Guard don't really have the movement on the Psykers to make that a reality for any given Psyker. The one exception to that is the Demon Prince with Wings, who is of course very quick for the army at 12-inch move, but does only have one cast, so he is far quicker, but there's a bit of a trade-off that there's only going to be one spell cast per turn from him. Now, spells go off of what's called a warp charge value. So each spell will have its warp charge value, and to perform the psychic test, you would roll 2d6, and you must hit at least that result or more. Now, some of the spells in the Death Guard Codex have a super mode. Now, Smite, of course, is available to all Psykers, and that has a super Smite at an 11 or a 12, but of course, a 12 you would also perils. So again, there are super spells here as well, but ultimately the warp charge value is the bare minimum you need to cast the spell. Do bear in mind, if your opponent has a Psyker in range to attempt to deny that, they would only need to roll more than your roll to deny the spell. So of course on a 12 they can't actually deny it, but you would take a perils, which is damage to the caster. All those further rules are in the core rulebook anyway, so by all means feel free to check those out. Let's jump in and take a look at the Contagion Discipline Spells. Spell number 1, Miasma of Pestilence. So this is a blessing, so it's a buff to your own unit, and realistically this is pretty much an auto take. It's a great buff. Many armies have the ability to do this, and why wouldn't you want to? Its warp charge value is 6, so fairly easy to cast. If manifested, select one friendly Death Guard unit within 18-inch of the Psyker, does not need line of sight, until the start of your next Psychic phase, so it's a whole battle round. Until the start of your next Psychic phase, subtract 1 from the attack's hit roll for any attack made against that unit. So you're giving them a buff to debuff the enemy by -1 to hit. Now that is true for both the shooting and fight phase, but things like, say, the Blight Hauler have a -1 to be hit in melee anyway. So if that is what you're trying to protect them from, you don't necessarily need to use it on a Blight Hauler and could use it for somebody else. So it's a great buff. -1 to hit is always going to have some average effect on the roll. You may get unlucky and your opponent doesn't roll whatever it was that would have been the result that the -1 affected. But again, on average, you're likely to reduce the amount of incoming hits, and that, of course, then carries over to the amount of damage you'll take. So again, further toughness, always great in an army that is already very tough and hard to remove. Spell number 2 is Gift of Contagion, which is a malediction. So this is a debuff on an enemy unit. It has a warp charge value of 5, so the easiest spell to get off in the Codex. If manifested, select one enemy unit within 18-inch of the Psyker, does not need line of sight. Until the start of your next Psychic phase, so again, a whole battle round, subtract 1 from the strength characteristics of models in that unit. If the result is an 8 or more, subtract 1 from the strength and attacks characteristics of models in that unit instead. So that's not a total -2 strength, -1 attack. It's just total -1 strength, -1 attack. So a fine toughness buff again for whatever unit is going to be attacked in melee by the target of this spell. -1 strength is chances are going to affect a wound roll breakpoint. That's probably why you're using it. And also -1 attack is a guaranteed attack that's missing essentially, which is always nice. It's particularly effective against hordes. If you imagine a 20-man squad of something with 2 attacks each, 40 attacks total, taking 1 off every model brings that down by 20 attacks, which is massive. If we're talking about something more like, say, a Redemptor Dreadnought, then, of course, that only has 5 attacks on the charge, but those 5 attacks are individually very powerful and quite likely to kill something. So even though it's not as effective against a big vehicle or big monster, certainly removing 1 of those attacks and meaning that that will not kill a model is very nice. But it just has more practical application against a horde. But the argument would be that horde armies aren't great against Death Guard. They don't tend to have a lot of strength 5. It would typically be less than that. So given the wound roll is going to be quite difficult for them anyway, you may not need Gift of Contagion against a horde and may prefer instead to use it against a high threat vehicle or monster, because reducing the strength and removing an attack could mean the difference between keeping 1 model in the unit alive or the unit being wiped. Not the strongest spell in my opinion. That's generally the one I leave behind, but it does have practical application. Spell number 3 is Plague Wind. This is a Witchfire, so direct damage. Plague Wind has a warp charge value of 6. If manifested, select 1 enemy unit within 18 and visible to the Psyker. Roll 1d6 for each model in that unit. For each 6, the unit suffers 1 mortal wound. If the result of the psychic test was a 9+, instead, suffer 1 mortal wound on a 5-up instead. So the odds there go from a 1 in 6 to a 1 in 3, which is significantly better. Plague Wind is a little bit overshadowed by the fact that it's bad against a character, because there's only 1 unit in the model. There are certain characters, like, say, Grimaldus for the Black Templars, that does count as having multiple units in the 1 unit of Grimaldus. Rather, multiple models in the 1 unit that is Grimaldus. So against a character like that, it can be more relevant, but there aren't that many characters like that, and truth be told, even Black Templars don't particularly run Grimaldus that frequently. I've played a little bit of Black Templars myself, and I can't find room for him. I just don't think he's good enough. So again, characters and units that are like that aren't that common. So this is very good against a horde. Again, if you roll in a dice each and it's a 20-man squad, then of course 20 dice, you're looking for 6s, you might get 4 or 5. That would be pretty nice. Same goes if you're hitting on the 5s, you might expect 8 or so, which again would eat through that horde very nicely. But again, the point being, a horde isn't necessarily something you're worried about as Death Guard. Yes, the high number of bodies is a challenge for what would be most likely a more elite army in the form of the Death Guard, but given that although they don't have many shooting attacks, they all have enough melee attacks to get a reasonable amount of work done. A squad of 5 Plague Marines with their upgrades now, having a flail in there, maybe a cleaver, you maybe use Haze of Corruption to allow damage to carry over, you wouldn't have a problem chewing through 1 wound models in a squad of 20. So you don't really need Plague Wind. It's kind of overshadowed by one of the other spells in the Contagion Discipline and overshadowed by Smite, which is just general, multi-purpose mortal wounds. So you may wish to take it to quash those hordes, but if you don't know you're coming up against that, it could be a bit of a liability. You may end up just using Smite instead. But given there's a vast number of Psykers in the Death Guard Codex, you might well just end up taking it to be like, well, I'll use it if it comes up, otherwise I'll use Smite instead. Spell number 4 is Putrescent Vitality. Putrescent Vitality has a warp charge value of 7. Blessed. So this is the highest warp charge value you'll see in the Codex. If manifested, select 1 friendly Death Guard infantry unit within 18 inch of the Psyker. Until the start of the next Psychic phase, add 1 strength and toughness to the characteristics of models in that unit. So this is a great offensive and defensive buff. Again, it is for until your next psychic phase. So it's a whole battle round, whether you go in first or go in second. Your opponent has to take their turn with this effect still in effect. So, of course, the +1 strength, it's great on anything that allows it to hit a break point of either strength 6 or strength 8, which are the general key break points for getting 2s to wound against most infantry and 2s to wound against most heavy or elites, and also being 3s to wound against most heavy supports. So that's for strength 6 and strength 8, not just one of them. So something like the Death Shroud, they're at strength 5 and strength 7 on their dual profile weapon. So hitting them with a Putrescent Vitality allows them to hit those really nice break points and have the pick of which profile they want to use to get the best wound roll out of any given target. The Toughness is also very nice. It's going to affect the break point in the opposite way when the opponent attacks you. So that's always a benefit. And another key use for this is on Poxwalkers. Whether or not you've got Typhus nearby, giving them the +1 strength up to strength 4, toughness 4, an additional strength and toughness on top of that makes them a real difficult unit to shoot through. They're only 5 points each, dirt cheap. If your opponent's committing their troop firepower to try and chew through Poxwalkers, typically that's going to be strength 4, not always, but it's going to be strength 4 a lot of the time. Getting them up to toughness 5 makes it that bit more unlikely that you'll lose models. Of course, they don't have armor saves, they've just got the 6-up feel no pain, so any damage that gets through is pretty likely to kill a model. You've got plenty of ways to bring them back though, so you're not worried about losing models, but I think making it that bit more difficult essentially throws a bit of your opponent's shooting phase away, which is always a benefit. So again, Putrescent Vitality, I think, is the second auto-include. Spell number 1, Miasma of Pestilence. Spell number 4, Putrescent Vitality. You cannot go wrong with those. Spell number 5, Curse of the Leper. So warp charge value of 6. If manifested, select the closest enemy unit within 18 inch and visible to the Psyker. Roll 7d6. On each dice result that exceeds the enemy's toughness characteristic, they suffer 1 mortal wound. So, of course, bearing in mind that if we're getting to relatively close range from, say, turn 2 or 3 onwards, maybe, they may well be affected by the Contagion of -1 toughness. So that's going to make the roll for this that bit easier. Now, this has the disadvantage of being bad against high toughness enemies. Something like a toughness 7 vehicle is only going to go down to 6 as a result of the Contagion, and you cannot exceed a 6 on a d6. So, of course, it does nothing against those models. But it is very good for infantry clearance. Even something like Space Marines or even Elite Space Marines, maybe up to toughness 5, they're going to come down to 4 or 3 for just typical Marines, and that's going to give you an opportunity to get a few mortal wounds through, maybe kill a model or 2. Against the typical Intercessor squad, you'd be looking at 3 or 4 mortal wounds, which just pips out Smite, because Smite, on average, you would get 2 mortal wounds. Of course, you could roll the Super Smite and get the big 6, but it's not that likely. So I like to take Curse of the Leper as well as on my damage dealing Psyker, and we'll quite often do a Curse of the Leper followed up by a Smite to dish out multiple batches of mortal wounds, hopefully kill a few models, if not wipe a squad, if you get lucky. And then the last spell here, Gift of Plagues. It is an auto-include to me, because this is the way I play, but it's not necessarily an auto-include. It's doing something that you don't need to happen, but might want to happen. So this is another blessing. Gift of Plagues has a warp charge value of 6. If manifested, select 1 friendly Death Guard unit from your army of within 18 inch of this Psyker. Does not need line of sight. Until the start of the next your next psychic phase, so again, it's a whole battle round, both players take a turn. Add 6 inch to the Contagion abilities that this unit has to a maximum of 12. So, of course, adding 6 inch means you're at the maximum 12 on turn 3, but it also means you've got a significantly larger Contagion range from the early turns. Turn 1, you're at 1 inch, turn 2, you're at 3 inch. So that's going to be 7 or 9, respectively, which is a significant range, to be fair. But the key use for this is in combination with Flash Outbreak, which is a stratagem. I'm going to come back to the stratagems and we'll talk about this in more detail, but the Flash Outbreak, it allows you to copy the Contagion effects of one model onto another, and the way that it's worded, those contagion changes that occur throughout the turn will continue to be copied over. Because Flash Outbreak occurs in the command phase, whereas this would occur in the psychic phase. As far as I read the rules, applying Gift of Plagues to the target you are copying does get copied over to the recipient of the Flash Outbreak. So not only does it allow you to copy the 6-inch extension onto a second model, but it also treats the whole army as being one turn further. So on turn 1, you would count as turn 2, so you'd have 3 inches, and you'd have the additional 6 on these 2 models, so you'd have 2 blobs of a 9-inch range for your Contagion, which is definitely possible to get models infected with the Contagion even as early as turn 1, but from turn 2, you're going to be treating it as if it's turn 3, so that would be 6 inches. Added the 6 from this, you'd have 2 12-inch range Contagion effects. And bearing in mind, that's a 12-inch radius. If you imagine a 24-inch pizza, it's pretty big, takes up a lot of the board. 2 of those on the board is going to cover a lot of it, particularly if one of those units is quite quick and can fly, like a fetid bloat drone. The model that's the sort of the copied member of the army, they're probably going to be fairly slow. Maybe they're just going to be touching up to the front lines, but the drone might well be able to push that bit further, maybe even make an advance and spread that contagion out more to help benefit your shooting phase in the earlier turns. So yeah, another fantastic spell. I like to use it an awful lot. I wouldn't go as far as to say it's an auto include, but because it depends if you want to use that particular combo. But if you do, then it becomes an auto include, because that's a key part of making Flash Outbreak as strong as it can possibly be. So that's everything for the Contagion disciplines. As we said, the only real change for Nephilim is that the Malignant Plaguecaster came down 5 points, so you might find yourself squeezing one of those in now that you can, because the rest of the army also went down in points, so you'll probably have roughly 100 left over to squeeze one in if you wanted to. Well, that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate everybody that's got involved. Whether you want to leave a like, a comment, a sub, you know how YouTube works, you know it helps me out, but I want to let you know I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. But either way around, thanks so much for watching the video, and I'll see you next time in the Underhive.